Outlaws had her on her knees in the dust. What happened next would change Bishop's Crossing, New Mexico territory forever. Not one of those men thought to look at the quiet stranger who had tied his horse at the end of the street 2 days ago, who had been watching the town from the shadow of the feed store doorway, who had already decided what he was going to do. He was just finishing the decision before he acted on it, because that was how Wade Cassidy did everything, completely, with no part of him uncommitted when the time came. The men standing over Della Mercer laughed. They were laughing when his boots hit the dirt of the main street. They would not be laughing long. Her name was Della Mercer. She was 24 years old, a widow of 4 months, and she ran the only sweetwater relay station for 40 miles in any direction in the New Mexico territory. This is her story, and the story of the stranger who stepped out of a doorway, and what it cost him, and what it gave back. Late summer, 1883. Now, friend, before we go a single step further, if this story is already getting under your skin the way it gets under mine, hit that subscribe button and ride along with us. And leave a comment right now. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I want to know who is out there. Drop a city, a country, whatever you feel like. I read every one. Let us go back to the beginning, back to Bishop's Crossing, back to the summer of 1883, and to the widow, and the deed, and the dangerous quiet man who was not supposed to be anyone's rescuer. Bishop's Crossing sat at the junction of 2 freight roads in Red Rock country, the kind of country where the mesas bled orange at dawn, and the heat built by 9 in the morning into something you could lean against. 25 buildings along a single main street, if you count it generously. To the south, the Tornado del Muerto, which is a Spanish name that translates to the Journey of the Dead Man, which tells you what you need to know about the country. The nearest army post was nearly 30 miles north, which meant that in Bishop's Crossing, you handled your problems yourself, or they handled you. Until the spring of that year, the town had managed reasonably well. Ben Mercer had been alive then, and Ben Mercer was the kind of man who keeps things from unraveling by the simple force of his steadiness. He ran the relay station, maintained the well, handled the horses for the stage line, and carried himself with a quiet assurance that makes people around a man feel more settled than they have any objective right to be. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He was simply present in a way that mattered, and the town of Bishop's Crossing organized itself around that presence without ever quite naming what it was doing, or recognizing how much weight it was placing on a single man's shoulders. Ben died in April from a fall off a horse on a rocky descent. His boot caught wrong in the stirrup, and a life that had been holding a great deal of things together was suddenly not there to hold them. They buried him on a Monday. By Wednesday of that same week, a man named Virgil Holt had ridden in from the south to pay his respects. Virgil Holt was the kind of man who uses the word respects without any awareness of its meaning. He ran 6 or 7 riders depending on the season, and he operated on behalf of a freight operator in Santa Fe named Aldous Creel, whose name appeared on no public document connected to the Holt Gang's activities, but whose money was very much behind every decision Virgil made. Creel owned freight lines, and he wanted to own water, and he wanted to own the relay station at Bishop's Crossing, which meant he wanted the deed, which meant he wanted Della Mercer gone. To understand what happened to the town over the 4 months that followed, you need to understand the men Virgil Holt used to do it. The first was a large man the others called Cutter, big across the shoulders, rust-colored beard, pale eyes that held nothing behind them resembling reflection. He was fond of cruelty in the way other men are fond of whiskey, as a thing that settles him and that he reaches for when bored. He moved slowly for a big man when there was no urgency, and very fast when he decided there was, which was the combination that had made him useful to Virgil for 3 years. He was the one who would put his boot to Della Mercer's face on the morning of August 19th. He was the one who would laugh about it. The second man was nimble and dark-haired, and went by Denny Fitch. He had come up from Texas under circumstances nobody explained and nobody pressed for, The kind of past that politely does not get discussed in frontier towns, because everyone in frontier towns has one. He was quick with a gun and quicker with a cruel word. And he understood something most men like him do not, which is that what his enemies feared was not the blow itself, but the anticipation of it. He worked on that anticipation the way a musician works a crowd, reading a room, building the tension, knowing exactly when the audience has been brought to the point where anything he does next seems inevitable. The third man was older, quiet, and went only by pew. Nobody in Bishop's Crossing ever learned his given name, and none of them were inclined to ask. He sat his horse with a stillness that made other men uneasy, even when nothing specific was happening. When he did speak, the words arrived with a finality that felt like a door closing on a room you were not going to be let back into. He was the one Virgil trusted most. He was probably the most dangerous man in the group, and the quiet in him was not peacefulness. It was the quality of a fire when there is no wind. Virgil himself was slender, and dressed better than his surroundings warranted, with a thin mustache he attended to with visible care. He had the voice of a man who once tried very hard to become a politician and decided somewhere along the way that taking what he wanted was more efficient than convincing people to give it. He was not personally brave. He was surrounded by men who were, and for his purposes that amounted to the same thing. What Virgil also had was patience. This was perhaps his sharpest tool. He had done this in 2 other towns before Bishop's Crossing, both of them smaller, both of them broken inside of 2 months. He knew the rhythm of it. You move in slow. You let the residents adjust to your presence as a permanent feature, the way the eye adjusts to a new shade of darkness. You never push past the point where a man has nothing left to lose, because a man with nothing left becomes unpredictable, and unpredictable is expensive. You wait for the weight of it to accumulate on its own. People tire before you do. That is the whole of the strategy, and it worked every time because it worked on human nature itself, and human nature does not change with the territory. For 4 months, from April through August, the Holt Gang had been in Bishop's Crossing the way a slow leak is in a boat. Not a crisis at first, just a persistent drain on everything. They took water from Della's well without payment. They commandeered relay horses and returned them lame, if they returned them at all. They occupied the saloon until the owner stopped charging them for drinks, because the alternative was watching Cutter break something he could not be made to pay for. They collected a percentage off every freight wagon that came through the crossing, which was not their freight, and not their road, and not their right. But rights in that country exist primarily in theory, and the men who hold them, theoretically, tend to have short tenure. The method was calibrated. That was the thing Della noticed in the early weeks, the precision of it. They never took so much that a family would have nothing left at all, which would have forced a reckoning they wanted to avoid. They left just enough that staying seemed more survivable than fighting, which is the oldest calculation in the business of subjugation. Virgil Holt had done this in other towns, and he understood that people with something left to lose are more pliable than people with nothing. People with nothing to lose have no reason to hold still, but Della was different from the other residents of Bishop's Crossing in one specific way, which was that she had more to lose than any of them, and she knew it. The station was not just her livelihood. It was the material fact of Ben's life's work, the thing his hands had built, the well he had dug before she ever arrived, the horses he had named. Signing the deed over to Creel was not a business transaction. It was the erasure of everything that remained of Ben Mercer in the world. And that she would not do. Not for Virgil's pleasantness, not for Cutter's boot, not for the weight of 4 months of fear piling up around her like snow. There were small things she held on to, the way Ben had laid the stones around the well mouth, each one fitted with the deliberate care of a man who expected the work to outlast him. The brass hook on the station door that he had leveled himself with a piece of string and a chunk of lead, because he could not abide a door that hung crooked. The ledger books in his handwriting, columns so precise they looked like they had been typeset rather than written by hand in lamplight after long days. These were the things that made the station more than a property. They were the record of a man who had cared about something, and caring about it in return was the only way she knew to honor that. She was not sentimental by nature. She was practical. But practicality and stubbornness are sometimes the same impulse pointing in the same direction, and Della Mercer's pointed firmly at holding what Ben had built until the last reasonable option had been exhausted. Della Mercer did not go quietly. She kept records from the beginning, meticulous ones in the same bound ledger books Ben had used for the station accounts. Every incident, every date, every name, every dollar that had been taken. She wrote letters to the territorial office in Santa Fe, formal and specific, that found no desk with the authority or inclination to act on them. She went to the constable, a narrow man named Blount, who received her with considerable sympathy and explained at length why there was nothing that could practically be done, given the current circumstances and the resources available to his office. She went to the families of Bishop's Crossing one by one. The Harrow Gates, who ran the dry goods store. The Salazar family. The minister, Forsyth, still knew enough to the position that the church had not yet broken him. She sat with each of them and laid out what she knew, and asked whether they would stand together, and she saw in their faces the thing she had feared seeing, which was not malice and not indifference, but plain fear. The fear of people who have already been pressed low enough that the distance between the floor and standing back up feels greater than they can manage. By August, she had run out of conventional roads. The night before the 19th, she sat at Ben's desk by lamplight, with his old revolver on the corner of the ledger, just to have something solid near her hand. She had made up her mind. If Virgil Holt came to the station again with his ledger and his pleasantness and his demand that she sign the deed, she was going to tell him no in terms he could not walk away from, or reinterpret. She wrote out the words on paper and read them back to herself, and they were the right words. She did not sleep much. She thought about the families she had visited, the Harrowgates, who had a good business, and a boy who was already a little afraid of his own shadow after what Cutter had done to him in May. The Salazar family, the husband moving carefully around his own house, the wife's eyes carrying something she was not going to talk about. Forsyth at his parsonage behind the broken windows, still there, still holding his position, but quieter in the pulpit than he had been in the spring. Good people, all of them. Frightened people. She did not blame them. She had been frightened herself every day for 4 months, and she had kept going anyway. Not because she was braver than they were, but because the alternative was giving up the one thing she had left of Ben. She thought about what it would take to make a town like this move. Not one person, not even her, something that shifted the weight of the calculation for everyone at once. A moment. She had been trying to create that moment with letters and records and formal requests, and it had not worked. She did not yet know what else to try. She set the revolver down and blew out the lamp and lay down on the bed with her boots on and listened to the night sounds of the station. And eventually, the long blue dark of the New Mexico summer came for her, and she slept. She was walking from the station to the general store when they intercepted her. Virgil was in the middle of the main street, Cutter and Denny flanking him. Pugh and 2 other men hung back at either end like brackets. Not yet. 9 in the morning, and the light already hard and bright. Virgil asked, pleasantly, whether she had given any further thought to their arrangement. Della stopped walking. She had given it a great deal of thought, she told him. The answer was, she would sooner burn the station to the ground than sign anything over to Aldous Creel or anyone connected with him. She did not know, in that moment, that naming Creel was a miscalculation. Something went out of Virgil's face like a lamp being turned down. He glanced at Cutter, and Cutter moved. He grabbed her arm and wrenched her sideways, hard enough that her feet left the ground for a moment, and when they found it again she was stumbling, and then her knees were in the dust, and her hands were down in it, and the boot caught her high on the left cheekbone as she went. She got her palms under herself in time to keep her face from striking the road, but only barely. There were people watching. The street was not empty. Doorways, the saloon porch, the ends of the road. Not one person moved. Virgil Holt leaned down and picked up the paper that had fallen from her hand. He turned it over. He looked at it. He looked at her. Della Mercer looked up from the dust with blood bright on her cheekbone, and her dark hair fallen loose across her face, shaking. And what was in her expression was not surrender. It was the specific, clean fury of a woman who has been pushed past the point where she has anything left to manage. A voice came from the feed store doorway, low, unhurried, the kind that does not need raising because it already owns the room. Step back from her. No one had seen the man cross the street. He was simply there, one shoulder against the door frame, thumbs in his belt, hat pulled low enough that his face was mostly shade. A gray coat, plain boots. He stepped out into the light, lean, maybe 35, with the economy of movement that comes not from thinness, but from a life in which no motion has been wasted. Clean-shaved jaw, eyes that were dark and level, and held the specific stillness of something that has been carefully managed over a long period of time. He looked at Virgil Holt the way you look at a calculation you have already done in your head and are not surprised by. Virgil asked who he was, and the question came out flatter than he intended it to. The man in the gray coat said his name. He said, Wade Cassidy. There are moments, friend, where the air in a place changes, where something lifts out of the dust and settles differently, and you can feel the shift in your back teeth before your mind names it. This was that kind of moment. The two men at the far ends of the street found their eyes suddenly very interested in the road ahead of them. Cutter had stopped laughing. Denny Fitch had his thumbs very deliberately on his saddle horn, nowhere near his gun. Pugh turned his horse. Without a word to Virgil, without a look backward, he turned his horse and walked it south. The sound of the hooves on the packed dirt was the clearest possible statement about where Pugh's estimate had landed. Virgil Holt handed Della the paper. He did it without expression and without comment. He said quietly that this was not finished. Then he turned, and his men turned with him, and they rode out of Bishop's Crossing, not running too careful for running. But they went. Della Mercer stood in the street with blood drying on her cheek and the paper in her hand, and looked at the man in the gray coat. You just bought yourself a war, she said. His answer was 2 words. I know. Now, friend, before we go any further into the story, I want you to understand what the name Wade Cassidy meant in the New Mexico Territory in those years. Because without understanding it, you cannot fully understand what it meant for that name to be standing in Bishop's Crossing's main street with 9 guns pointed in its direction. And you cannot understand the thing that happened in the space between when Virgil Holt heard the name and when he made his decision. Wade Cassidy had come up through Colorado, ranch work, on a big cattle operation in his early 20s, before the water war burned half the valley. Then, Abilene, deputy marshal. 3 years of it, good years in terms of the work itself, until one particular night that made an official position untenable in a way that could not be untangled. Then 2 years riding with a man named Dalloway, across 2 territories, which ended when Dalloway made a choice that Cassidy would not make and would not overlook. And the distance between what Dalloway was willing to do and what Cassidy was willing to do turned out to be the distance between one side of a line and the other, and the line could not be uncrossed. Since Abilene he had killed 7 men, each one in circumstances that were their own story and their own weight. He did not enjoy the number. He had long since stopped pretending it could be smaller than it was. It was the number, and he carried it the way you carry something that cannot be put down, and that you have stopped trying to put down. He was not a legend in the dime novel sense. He did not perform. He did not polish the reputation or trade on it or enjoy the way the room changed when people heard his name. He was simply a man who was extremely good at a specific thing, and who had made a clear-eyed accounting over many years of what that meant and what it cost and what it required of him. That accounting, if you had access to it and could read it, would tell you something important. It would tell you that Wade Cassidy had never once in his life started a fight. Every situation he had been in, every one of those 7 that counted, had been a situation he had stepped into that was already running without him. A woman in trouble. A man being taken advantage of. Something wrong unfolding in front of him that no one was stopping. He had a specific quality of conscience that made it impossible for him to observe that kind of wrong and continue going about his business. He had tried over the years. He had tried to simply keep his head down and his boots pointed away from other people's difficulties. He had never quite managed it. He was not certain this was a virtue. He was aware that it had cost him a great deal. He was aware that there were men still alive who would have preferred that cost to be higher. He was also aware that he slept reasonably well, which was more than some men could say, and he had arrived at the conclusion that this was connected to the conscience, and the stepping in and the cost, that these things were all part of the same mechanism and could not be separated without changing what he was. He had ridden into Bishop's Crossing 2 days before August 19th because his horse needed water and he needed sleep. He had taken a room above the hardware store, stabled the horse, eaten 2 good meals at the station's cook fire, and intended to be on the road by Wednesday morning. He had seen Della Mercer on his first morning in town. She was walking the main street to check the stage schedule, carrying herself with the particular uprightness of a woman who is under considerable weight and has decided that the way she carries herself is the one thing she still controls. He watched her with the trained habit of a man who has learned to know a place by knowing the people in it. He noticed how the townspeople looked at her, and then looked away. He noticed the Holt riders at the end of the street, the way one of them called something after her that made her shoulders go tight. He noticed all of it, and he did nothing about any of it, because it was not his town and not his problem, and the road north was as clear on Tuesday as it had been on Sunday. Then Tuesday morning arrived. He was in the feed store when the commotion began in the street. He came to the doorway. He watched Cutter Ames grab Della Mercer's arm. He watched her go down in the dust. He watched the boot. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he moved, not hesitating, making a decision the way he made decisions, completely no part of him uncommitted before he acted. He knew what crossing that threshold meant. He knew what it would cost and what it would delay. And what the odds were, he weighed it all with the directness of a man who does not deceive himself about the rooms he walks into. Then he weighed it against a woman in the dust of the main street, with a boot finding her face, and the calculation resolved itself the way it always had when it came to this specific question. He stepped out of the doorway. You know how that part went. After the Holt Gang rode out, the town of Bishop's Crossing resumed its quiet in the particular way of a place that has just narrowly missed something terrible. Doors closed. The bartender who had been watching from the saloon porch went back inside and started mopping. Constable Blount appeared briefly at the edge of his office door, looked at the street, and went back in. Della walked to the station. Cassidy walked alongside her, unhurrying, parallel, saying nothing. At the station door she turned and looked at him, and then she stepped aside. Come in. He sat at the table she pointed to and took his hat off, which she noticed. Dark hair. A face that was younger than she had expected for the weight behind the eyes. A jaw set with the quietness of a man accustomed to other people filling the silence. She washed her face at the basin, dried it, and came back and set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from him. What followed was less a conversation than a transaction of necessary information. She gave him the shape of the past 4 months, the records, the letters, the constable's careful uselessness, the family she had visited, and the fear in their faces. She laid it out without ornament or request for pity, in the manner of someone presenting facts that another person needs in order to be useful. He asked 2 or 3 questions. They were the right questions. She asked why he had done it. He took a moment before answering. The answer was plain. He had seen her in the dirt. He could not walk past that. There was nothing theatrical about this, nothing that was reaching for credit or effect. It sat on the table between them like a plain fact, something that held weight without claiming anything about itself. She looked at him for a moment, and then neither of them added anything to it. And the silence that followed was the comfortable kind that does not need filling. He went out to see to his horse at the well, and when he came back, she had put a plate of cold biscuits and leftover venison on the table. She was at Ben's desk writing. He sat back down and ate, and neither of them made anything of the plate being there. He spent that afternoon walking the town in the way he had learned to walk a place he needed to understand, quietly, unhurrying, not visible as anything more than a man going about ordinary business. By mid-afternoon, the Holt Gang's numbers had grown to 9, 3 additional riders having come in from the south. He walked the main street end to end and memorized the angles and distances and the afternoon shadows of the buildings and where the sun would sit in 6 hours. He noted the constable's office, which was locked. He was thorough about it. The hardware store on the east side had a narrow alley on its south face that opened onto the road at a specific angle, enough of a blind approach that a man coming from the stable side could be in the middle of the street before anyone at the far end saw him. The dry goods store porch jutted 3 feet into the road and created a natural break in any line of fire down the length of the street. The feed store doorway, where he had been standing that morning, was recessed just enough to be shaded through most of the day, which mattered if he intended to stand in it at the right hour. He noted all of it. He counted paces between buildings. He looked at the water barrel by the hardware door and the hitching posts and the angles between them. He was not planning a battle. He was making a map. A battle, if it came to that, would use the map he was building in his mind, the framework inside which a plan would live. Not a plan in the sense of a sequence of events he could control, because you cannot control a thing like what was coming, and the men who have tried have generally ended badly. But a framework, a set of positions and distances and variables, understood well enough that when the moment required improvisation, the improvisation could happen in a space that had been pre-mapped. He had learned this over years of situations that did not give him the option of certainty. You work with what you can know. You leave room for what you cannot. He found Esteban Cruz in the stable, the gray-haired hostler who had been in Bishop's Crossing for 15 years. Esteban looked at him across a horse's neck with the eyes of a man who had lasted 15 years in a town like this by knowing which strangers to talk to. Cassidy asked about the families. Not the Holt Gang, the families of the town. What they had been through, what they had lost, what was left in them. Esteban looked at him for a long count, and then he started talking. He walked Cassidy through it carefully and in detail, because he had been watching and remembering for 4 months, and no one had yet asked him to share what he had seen. He talked about the Harrogate family, Frank and Meredith, and the boy of 12 who Cutter had roughed up in May for no reason beyond being in the wrong place when Cutter was in the wrong mood. He talked about how Frank had not spoken about it publicly, had not filed any complaint, had gone back to running his store the next morning as if it had not happened, and how the not speaking about it was the thing that had cost him something he had not fully recovered. He talked about the Salazar family, the husband who had ridden out to confront Virgil directly, and come back 3 days later moving stiffly in a way he never explained, and how his wife served people at their table now with her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and a quality of absence in them that had not been there in the spring. He talked about Forsyth, the young minister, how he had stood up in his pulpit twice in those first weeks, and preached with genuine fire about justice and the obligations of community. Good sermons, the kind that make people nod and feel the better for having come. And how he had come home on a Sunday evening to find every window of his church broken, every pane nothing remaining but the empty frames. How he had preached the following Sunday on a different subject, and the Sunday after that, and how the congregation had noticed the change and felt something go out of them in response to it. Because when the man whose job is courage stops performing it, the people watching take that as information. Cassidy listened to all of it. At the end, he asked Esteban one question. If the moment came where standing up felt possible rather than simply suicidal, if the numbers on the street were different enough that it was not just one man against the whole thing, did he think those families had enough left in them to stand? Esteban Cruz was quiet for a while. He rubbed a horse's neck and looked at the stable wall. He thought they might, he said finally. They were not cowards. They had never been cowards. They were people who had been waiting, each of them separately, for a moment they could not produce on their own, the moment when the cost of staying down exceeded the risk of standing up. When someone else had already moved and the movement was real enough that joining it felt less like suicide and more like solidarity, if that moment arrived, if it was genuine. Cassidy thanked him and went back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the late afternoon light and thought about what Esteban had told him. He thought about Forsyth's empty sermon and Frank Harrowgate's careful silence, and the Salazar man's careful movement, and all the small specific ways that 4 months of sustained pressure had whittled at what these people were. He thought about the letter that needed writing tonight, and the visit to Forsyth that needed to happen in the morning. He sat with it for a while, the weight of what he was proposing, which was not simply a gunfight on a main street, but the particular thing that had to happen before the gunfight, which was convincing 15 people to open their doors. He was not going to be on the road by Wednesday. He wrote the letter that night by the same kind of lamplight Della had been using for 4 months. Names, dates, amounts, incidents, the specific language of a man who has spent time in law offices and knows what makes a complaint actionable versus what makes it something a clerk sets aside. He wrote it plainly, without flourish, and signed his own name to it with the understanding that his name meant something to the marshal's office, even if it meant something complicated. He folded it and set it on the table and sat with it for a moment. The town was quiet outside. A horse shifted in the stable. Somewhere down the main street, one of the Holt riders was playing a harmonica badly, the sound floating up into the dark. There were 9 of them now spread around the town, and they were comfortable in their comfort, the comfortable ease of men who expect to get what they came for. That comfort was the only real advantage Cassidy had, and he intended to use it. Men who are comfortable are not ready. Men who are not ready make decisions from reflex rather than judgment, and decisions from reflex in a street standoff favor the man who has already thought through the position. He blew out the lamp and lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and ran through what he knew and what he did not know, and how the gap between them would have to be managed. He was calm in the way a man is calm when he has done this enough times to know that calm is not the absence of awareness, but the management of it. He was not certain of the outcome. He had never once in his life been certain of the outcome. He slept. He was up before dawn. At first light he went to the parsonage behind the broken-windowed church. When Forsyth opened the door, wariness in his face from a season of mornings that had taught him caution, Cassidy put it to him plainly. There were families in this town who had been waiting for a specific moment, the moment where the calculation changed and standing became possible. He believed that moment might come today. He needed the minister to reach those families in the next few hours. Forsyth stood in his collar and his spectacles in the doorway and took inventory of Cassidy's face for a long moment. He was maybe 30, with the creased forehead of a man who thinks more than he sleeps. He would be in the street at noon, he said. Then Cassidy went to the station. Della was already there, already carrying the day. She looked at his face when he came in and shifted into readiness the way she shifted into everything now, without preamble. He laid it out across the table, the position he intended to take, the letter that needed to go north by special rider before nightfall, a detailed accounting of everything in her records with the names Holt and Creel attached, signed by as many residents as Forsyth and Esteban could reach in the hours between now and when this happened, what she needed to do and where she needed to be. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she was not going to stand in a church doorway while someone else settled her fight. He understood that. He was not asking her to hide. He was asking her to be visible at the right moment, because what he was counting on was that the people of Bishop's Crossing, who had been watching from behind their doors for 4 months, were going to need something to look at when the moment came. They needed to see Della Mercer standing, not sheltered, out in the open, in her own street, with the deed to her own property on her hip. She thought about it. She thought about the 4 months of careful records and the letters that went nowhere and the faces of the families. Then she said, "All right." She picked up Ben's revolver from the desk and put it on her hip. That night, Esteban Cruz's nephew left Bishop's Crossing riding north with a letter in his saddlebag. It was signed by Forsyth, and by Frank Harrogate, and by Esteban Cruz, and by Della Mercer, and it named every member of the Holt Gang, and it named Aldous Creel, and it contained 4 months of dates and incidents backed by the records in the station ledger. A postscript in a different hand noted that the signatory was a witness and would testify. The rider would make Santa Fe by the following evening. Bishop's Crossing did not know it. Virgil had spent the night of the 19th making his own final calculation, the assessment of a man who had been publicly backed down and needed a public answer. He had decided that one man and a famous name were still one man, and that one man bled. The Holt Gang came south end of the main street at 10:30 on the morning of August 20th. 9 riders, strung loose across the road's width, Virgil at the center on a big bay horse with his hat forward and nothing of pleasantness remaining in his face. He had made his decision. The street was empty. Not the ordinary empty of an early morning, the deliberate empty of a street that has chosen to hold itself still. Virgil stopped his horse in the middle of it and looked in both directions, and felt the specific unease of a man who is very good at reading runes, and is reading this one and finding something wrong with the reading. Cassidy came out of the alley between the hardware store and the barber's shop on the east side, 20 yards from Virgil's position. He came out quietly and stood in the open and put his hand on his coat and looked at Virgil Holt. 9 men, 1 set of hands. The numbers were perfectly clear. The numbers were also wrong. Virgil restored the pleasantness like a man putting on armor, and put his proposition on the table. 1 man against 9 was a poor calculation. The sensible course was for Cassidy to ride out and allow them to complete their business with the widow. Nothing personal. Cassidy let him finish. "Look at your men," he said. Virgil looked at his men. Pugh was still. Cutter had the pale eyes working behind them with something that was not the comfortable certainty that was usually there. Denny Fitch had his thumbs on the saddle horn, both hands not near his gun. "You can't watch all of us," Virgil said. "I don't have to." He stepped back 1 pace and put his left shoulder against the hardware store wall and his thumbs in his belt, and watched Virgil Holt and waited. In the silence of that moment, Bishop's Crossing showed itself. The door of the dry goods store opened. Frank Harrogate came out onto his step with a rifle across his arm, not pointing it at anything, just present on his step with it, in the morning light. Then Meredith Harrogate came out beside him. Frank would later be unable to explain how he might have stopped her if he had tried. And in truth, he did not try. From the alley on the west came 2 brothers who worked delivery men Cassidy had never specifically spoken to, who had made their own decisions somewhere in the night. From the parsonage direction came Forsyth in his collar, carrying nothing at all. A man of God walking into the middle of a street standoff with his hands open at his sides. That is its own kind of courage, friend. The kind that does not have a gun to fall back on. From the south end of the street, from the direction of the station, came Della Mercer. She was not in the church doorway. She had Ben's revolver on her hip and her chin high, and the bruise from the previous morning standing gold and purple on her cheekbone in the August light. And she walked straight down the middle of her own street the way a woman walks into a room she owns, which is what she was doing. Because this was her town and her street, and the deed was in her name, and nobody was going to change that. 15 people in the street inside of 2 minutes. Not all of them armed. Some of them carrying nothing except their presence and whatever it took to make their feet move to where they moved. Cutter turned his head and counted them. His face did something it was not accustomed to doing. Denny Fitch's arithmetic was visible on his face. The answer was not the one he had come into the street expecting. Pugh turned his horse, same as the morning before, without announcement and without a word. He turned and walked south, and the sound of his horse's hooves on the packed dirt road was the only sound on the street for a long moment. Virgil Holt watched Pugh go. He watched the 15 people arranged across the width of the main street behind the lean man in the gray coat. He watched Della Mercer with Ben's revolver on her hip and her chin up, and that look on her face that had never at any point in the past 4 months looked like surrender. Cassidy had one more thing to place on the table. He had held it back deliberately, because Virgil Holt was not a man who only needed to lose. He was a man who needed to understand precisely how it had happened, and who had done it, and by what mechanism, or he would not believe it was real. A letter, Cassidy said, had gone north the night before by special rider, the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe. A specific accounting of every activity of the Holt Gang from April through August, signed by 4 residents of Bishop's Crossing. It named Virgil Holt and each of his men. It named Aldous Creel. He said Creel's name once, clearly. What happened in Virgil Holt's face, then, was not fear in the ordinary sense. It was the completion of a calculation that did not come out the way any of his calculations had ever come out before. He was a man who planned carefully and who depended on those plans, and the specific sensation of finding that someone had been planning around him had been a step ahead of him from before this morning began, was something Virgil Holt had never quite experienced in his career and found that he did not enjoy. He looked at the 15 people in the street. He looked at Cassidy. He looked at Della Mercer one final time, with the look of a man who has just understood he was not dealing with a frightened widow, and never had been. Then he turned his horse. No last word, no statement of what came next. The pleasantness was gone, and so was the threat, and all that remained was a man riding south, and the rest of the gang falling in behind him, some faster than others, all of them going, the sound of their horses fading into the Red Rock country, until there was only the morning and the people standing in the street, and a silence that had a different quality than any silence Bishop's Crossing had held in 4 months. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Frank Harrogate laughed. It was the laugh of a man who does not entirely believe the weight that has just come off him, slightly bewildered and a little giddy with relief, and it was the most contagious sound on the street, because everyone on that street felt exactly what he was feeling. Meredith laughed. The Livery Brothers laughed. Forsyth was shaking hands with the Salazar man, with both of his, and looking like a minister who has just remembered the reason he became one. Della Mercer walked to where Cassidy was standing. She looked at him with the directness that had characterized everything she had done since April. "Did you actually send a letter to the marshal?" The edge of the almost smile appeared. Esteban's nephew had left at 9 the previous evening, he told her. Santa Fe by the following evening, give or take. She absorbed this. That was before or after you decided to stand out here with 9 men pointed at you. Before, and the letter was part of why the street worked the way it worked. The numbers in the open are only part of any calculation. The rest of it is what happens after. And the letter changed what happened after. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the station, and he fell in alongside her the same as the morning before. At the station door, she stopped. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." They sat at the table and drank it. Outside, Bishop's Crossing was making the noise a town makes when it has just been returned to itself after a long absence. Voices in the street, doors open, the sound of people talking above the ordinary ambient level of a morning, animated in a way that 4 months of suppression had made temporarily unfamiliar. Della spread the account books on the table. The freighting contracts, she explained, were recoverable now that Creel's stranglehold on the road was lifting. Most of the freight operators had been waiting for exactly this. She had notes on each of them. What they had been paying Creel's people and what they had been paying before Creel's people, and what the road was worth without that tax. She had been building the plan for what came after, in the same steady way she had been building the case, because she had always expected to be here at this table with the deed in her name, and the next phase to begin. He looked through the records with genuine attention. They were very good. The dates were precise, the amounts exact. The incidents described in language specific enough to be verified and neutral enough to hold up to scrutiny. He had seen official marshal's office filings less careful than these. He asked questions about the water rights attached to the well, and about the stage line contract, and she had clear answers to each. She told him about Ben, not extensively but with the specific care of someone who wants a particular person understood accurately rather than sentimentally. The man he had been, the things about him that had made the station work, the way the town had organized itself around his steadiness, without quite naming what it was doing. The morning of the accident, the Wednesday when Virgil Holt had ridden in with his ledger. She said it plainly and without reaching for emotion, which was the right way to say it, because the truth of a person does not require ornamentation. He listened without filling her pauses. She asked about Colorado. He gave her some of it. The ranch, the water war, Abilene, the shape without the detail. She did not press for the detail because she had the instinct of someone who recognizes that another person's weight is theirs to carry, and reaching for it uninvited does not lighten it. The afternoon light was tilting through the station windows when he stood and put his hat on. She walked with him to the door. The Holt Gang would not come back, he told her, not without Creel's money, and Creel's name in a letter to the marshal made him disinclined to keep funding a venture that had acquired legal attention. The constable was worth having a conversation with about what his position now required. If Blount had any sense of self-preservation, this morning would have educated him. If he did not, that was useful to know too. I have known that since April, she said. He almost smiled. The same as the other times. The thing that did not quite complete itself. He stepped off the porch. The shadow of the western mesa had come down across the far end of the main street, and the air was a degree cooler. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. You kept very good records, he said. 4 months of them. That is what made the letter real. That is what gave it weight, because of what you built. Della Mercer stood in the doorway of the station whose deed bore her name and looked at Wade Cassidy in the late afternoon gold. Where are you going from here? He looked north and south down the road. The habit of a man who has never had a fixed answer to that question. North, he said. Eventually. She nodded. She did not ask anything more. He put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Thank you, Wade, she said. Take care of that well, he said. He went to get his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride out the north end of Bishop's Crossing in the last of the light. The gray coat going gold in the sunset. The horse moving at the same unhurried pace it had arrived with 2 days before. He did not look back. Men like that rarely do. Not because the weight of what they leave is not there. It is very much there. But they have learned that looking back makes the leaving harder, and the leaving is necessary, and they have made their peace with what is necessary. Now, friend, I have told you this story the way an old man tells a true one, with the rough edges still on, the way they happened. Let me tell you the rest of it, because stories like this one do not end when the riders disappear south. The Holt Gang scattered inside a week. 3 of them were taken up by the territorial marshal's men acting on the letter Reuben Cruz delivered to Santa Fe, the specific names and the specific dates, backed by 4 months of meticulous station records. Cutter Ames made it to Arizona before finding the kind of trouble that men built the way Cutter was built reliably find, and nobody in Bishop's Crossing mourned the news when it arrived. Denny Fitch went to California, which had its own problems and eventually its own people to sort them out. Pugh was never found, which, if you consider the kind of man Pugh was probably the most intelligent decision he made in a long career of making more intelligent decisions than the people around him. Aldous Creel resigned his freight operations in Santa Fe before October. He was not prosecuted, because men at his level rarely are. The distance between evidence and consequence being one of the persistent sorrows of any justice system. But he was diminished, and he lived a smaller life afterward, and that was its own kind of accounting. Constable Blount remained in his position for 6 more months. The town eventually found the grounds to replace him with a deputy named Ruiz, who had been suited for the job for 2 years, and who proceeded to do it correctly. Della Mercer ran the relay station for 20 more years. She rebuilt the freighting contracts inside a season, every one of them, because the men who moved goods through that part of New Mexico had been waiting for Creel's tax to be lifted, and wasted no time once it was. She added 2 buildings to the station property in the mid-'80s and employed 3 hands by '91, and she kept the Sweetwater well in working order and never once charged a family that could not pay, which had been Ben's rule and remained hers, and will likely remain it until the last person who drew from that well is gone. She never saw Wade Cassidy again. She heard the name a few times over the years, here and there, the way you hear a name that is living its complicated life out in the territory. She did not look for him. She did not need to. She had the deed and the well and the records and the 15 people who had opened their doors on an August morning. She had been in the dirt, and she had gotten up. That was what she had, friend, and it was enough. It was the whole of it, and Wade Cassidy rode north and continued to be the thing the territory occasionally needed, quiet and capable and willing to step out of a doorway when the alternative was walking past what he could not walk past. He collected no legend he sought. He kept his own accounting and paid down the debt he owed to something older than law in each situation where it presented itself. And he rode on. Now, the lesson this story carries is not the simple one. It is not that a legendary gunslinger will always ride into your town and set things right, because they will not, and that is not the world. The lesson is about the 15 people who opened their doors. The families of Bishop's Crossing were not cowards. They were afraid, which is a different thing. They were each waiting, separately and without knowing the others were waiting, for the moment when the calculation changed. What it took to change it was one man stepping out of a shadow and one woman getting back up from the dust and keeping her chin level, and those 2 acts together created the moment that the 15 had been waiting for. The open door was always there. It just needed someone to go through it first. Sometimes going first looks like a man in a gray coat who simply cannot walk past a woman in the dirt. Sometimes it looks like a 24-year-old widow keeping 4 months of records in a bound ledger by lamplight after everyone else has gone to sleep. Sometimes both. There is a version of this story where Wade Cassidy rides out of Bishop's Crossing, before it comes to the standoff, where he talks himself out of the doorway, reminds himself it is not his town, and the road north takes him where he was going. In that version, Della Mercer eventually loses the station, because she runs out of options and the weight of what she is carrying breaks something that cannot be repaired. In that version, the 15 people never open their doors, because the moment never arrives. That version happens all the time, friend. Everywhere. Every day. It is the version that does not get told, because there is no story in a man who kept walking. What makes this version worth telling is simply that he stopped. If this story hit you the way it hits me to tell it, I am glad you were here for it. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave that comment. Tell me what time it is. Tell me what part of this story you will carry with you. There are more of these. Long ones. The kind you settle in for. So find yourself a comfortable spot, partner, and I will see you on the next ride. Take care of yourself out there. Take care of yourself.